We continue our look at discipleship from Luke chapter 9 verse 23. This is the second message. In the first one we looked at the difference between a disciple and a follower, and using the contexts of which we did for those terms, we said that God is not looking for followers or just followers, but rather he's looking for disciples, for those who will stick with him through the difficult times as well as the good ones. And now in this message and then the next two, we look at the points that Jesus made. In a sense, he gave us 3 boxes to tick to test whether we are disciples or not. Although of course it's not about just ticking boxes, is it? It's about the human heart. It's about our attitude and where our thoughts really are and where our heart really lies. But they're good pointers and they're good indicators for us to look at, to strive towards, so that we can continue on the path of discipleship. The first thing that Jesus said when he started to list, or the first point he made, he said that if we want to be disciples, if we want to come after him, which is what discipleship is, he said we must deny ourselves. Notice the use of the word must. It's not an optional extra. It's not something that we can decide to do if we want to, and if we don't, it doesn't really matter. If we are to be disciples, and that should be the aim of all people that would claim Christ as their Lord and Saviour, if we are to be disciples, then we must deny ourselves. What does it mean to deny ourselves? Well, I had to think about it and I came up with 3 points. I'm sure we could come up with plenty more if we wanted to, but for the sake of this message, 3 points that I want to look at to ensure that we're in the right place with God, discipleship, as opposed to just being a follower in regards to denying ourselves. First of all, we have to defeat pride in our lives. Pride is a killer. Now, of course, there is a sense where we talk about being proud of something. We can be proud of our children, proud of our grandchildren, or whatever the case may be. And in that sense, where it stays as that, there's no issue at all. There are many things that we could be proud of in that sense, no issue at all. But when that pride leads to arrogance, where it starts to take us to a place whereby we think we're better than someone else. For example, our grandchildren, and I'm a grandfather, and I love my granddaughter, and I'm very proud of her, but I don't think that she's better than anyone else. To me, she's my granddaughter, and I love her. But whatever she achieves in life, I will never take that attitude or view that she's better than others. But if I did, then that's a sort of pride that defeats the path of discipleship in our lives. Because as we know, pride comes before a fall. And that's a well-known saying. It's from the Bible. It's a well-known saying, not just for people in church, but for people outside of it as well. And it's a well-known saying because it's true. Once we start to get arrogant, then there is always a fall just around the corner. So pride, or being proud of things or achievements or whatever in a certain context, is okay. But once it leads to arrogance, then it definitely contradicts with the path of discipleship. And if we are to be disciples, we must deny ourselves, which means that we have to get rid of pride from our lives, because pride sets us up. It makes us difficult to have relationships with people. And I'm not just talking about a husband or a wife, I'm talking about any relationships. Pride is a killer in that sense. It makes us very prickly in terms of our character. It sets us up always for conflict. And so that's why we must deny ourselves. It means literally, I suppose, we're putting God first, others second, and ourselves last. That's contrary to our human nature, our fallen human nature, but that's the path we have to walk on if we are to fulfill the challenge and the call of discipleship on our lives. Secondly, as well as pride, we have to defeat selfishness in our lives. I would say certainly in the society that I'm from, 21st century UK, that selfishness is a major issue. I can remember when I was younger, I grew up on an estate where it was built between the wars, and a lot of the folks that had moved in were from the First World War generation. They're people that used to tell tales and stories of that particular time. And I can remember where my mum would say, pop round to the neighbours and just borrow this. The typical one is a cup of sugar that people talk about. Those times were real. If you're young and you think that's just mythology, those sort of things used to happen before the days of supermarkets, when there used to be a little shop down the road that used to shut at 5 every day. People would borrow from one another, help each other out. There was definitely more of a community spirit in those days. And we didn't need neighbourhood watch to tell us to look after each other. There was definitely a community-minded attitude around in those times, certainly more than there is today. I would say, for whatever reason, and people have their own ideas and their own reasons as to why, and probably there are many factors that come together, but I would also say that today we live in a more selfish, self-centered society, where people, in the main, it's not a generalization, it's just a view really of where we are, or should I say it is a generalization, it's not an attack on specific people, it's a view of where we are, that we are in less of a caring society. I read something recently where some politician was saying that we need to introduce a part of nurses' training for them to care for people. Now, for me, that should be one of the reasons, or the reason, why you want to become a nurse, because you care for people. We shouldn't have to teach people in that position that they have to care for folks. So for me, that was just a little reflection of where we are as a society, that we are, sort of generally speaking, quite selfish and not open for the common good as perhaps people used to be many years ago. But if we are to be disciples of Christ, we must deny ourselves, which means that we have to defeat this selfishness in our lives. We have to be prepared to tackle it, to recognise it, to come against it, and to literally work down a different path. I work in Africa, and I've done for many years, and as well as preaching the gospel and working with churches and the spiritual dimension of what I do, also been involved in many practical projects that aren't just for church people, but are for the whole village: orphanages, wells, clinics, equipping basic schools and that sort of thing. And I find that even now, after all these years, that my work in Africa is the perfect antidote to living in a selfish society like I do in Britain. It's wonderful to be able to make a difference in people's lives. And as I speak, just tomorrow morning, we're about to make a transfer for a 4-figure sum, so a reasonable amount of money, out to Africa for a clinic that works with people, that does consultations, helps people with medical problems, also does it practically in a very real sense, but also does it in the name of Christ. So it's not just about preaching at people, but it's also about meeting people where they are in their physical situations. And I get a lot of pleasure from that, working in Africa and being a mobiliser, helping those things to go. I'm just a channel. It's not my money. I'm not giving away my money. I'm not wealthy or anything like that. I'm just there to raise support, see donations come in, and then channel them out the other end. And I find, as I say, that's the perfect antidote to living in a selfish society. We may not work in Africa. We can. There's always opportunities for us at SICM, always opportunities for people to get involved. But whatever it is, we give of ourselves, maybe charity work of some description, something that we feel a particular call for. And it helps to defeat that selfishness in our lives. Once we start to think about others, work for others, and help those people who perhaps are in a difficult situation, many times through no fault of their own, we're able to make a difference in their lives. It becomes a perfect antidote to the sort of society that we live in today. So if we are to be disciples of Christ, and we are to walk that path, we must deny ourselves, which means that we get rid of that pride, that selfishness, and thirdly, it means that we get rid of that self-promotion that is very evident in today's society. There are so many programs on television that are designed for people to make a name for themselves. They're designed for people to have their 5 minutes of fame, to be recognised, to be on television, because there seems to be in our society, not with everyone of course, but a definite desire in a lot of people that they would become famous, even if it's only for 5 minutes. They want to have that moment of glory and be recognised in the street because they're famous. Now, of course, people can become famous, people can become celebrities, they can become well known, and there's nothing wrong with that in itself, because if we are, and we live in the age of the internet with blogs and YouTube and all those mediums that are available to us, we may have a hobby, we may have an interest, we may have a particular profession or a career, and we do become well known. And there's nothing wrong with that. We can't help that. You could be a bird watcher, for example. I'm a very amateur bird watcher, but you could be a really keen bird watcher with a professional attitude, and you start to get a name, a reputation, a positive reputation, because you're so dedicated and committed to it, and your blog starts to get a lot of hits. You have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, all that sort of thing, Twitter account, and you start to get people following you. That's not necessarily self-promotion. Self-promotion is really what's going on inside. Why are we doing those things? Is it because we just genuinely love our hobby, our interest, our career, and we like to share with other folks the things that we get involved with, the things that we see in the case of bird watching? Or are we trying to make a name for ourselves? So there is a difference, of course. We can't say that just because someone is well known, not even famous or a celebrity, but just well known in their particular field, that they've promoted themselves, that their life is about self-promotion. We can't say that. And indeed, if you're a Christian and you do become well known in a particular field, actually it gives you a greater platform for which to reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So it can be a good thing, and it is a good thing in that sense. So I'm not talking about people becoming well known. He's well known, he must be promoting himself. No, there's nothing wrong with that at all. I know some bands, Christian bands, and they have YouTube channels and Facebook pages, Twitter accounts, and they're always posting videos, they're always posting gigs and all that sort of thing. That doesn't mean to say they're promoting themselves, self-promotion, but of course we have to look at the attitude and what's behind it. And sometimes only we know really what's our motive, or what our motive really is. But if it's about self-promotion, if it's about being famous, if it's about being recognised, if it's about making a name for ourselves because we want to be famous, then that's a definite no-no. That contradicts with what the Bible's talking. We should make Christ known. That's what being a disciple is all about. If we have a bigger platform on which to do it, that's great. That's wonderful. If we've got 1 million followers on Twitter, then that means there's more people that we're reaching with the gospel than if we've got just 2 followers. So we can't say that the person with more followers than someone else has promoted himself. It's wrong to say that. It depends what the heart attitude is in the sense of the promotion that goes along the way. So discipleship, in our second week, we begin to look at the points, the 3 points that we will look at in the next 2 messages. But this one, he must deny himself. It means we have to recognise pride, we have to recognise selfishness, and we have to recognise self-promotion. And if we find those in our lives, it's good to look at ourselves. It's good to be analytical, not to criticise ourselves and put ourselves down, but to look inwardly, openly and honestly. And if we recognise those 3 things in our lives, then we need to deal with them. Otherwise, we will never begin to fulfil the call, the challenge of discipleship upon our lives.